What do you think? Should we tell him? Yeah? Friends, Kumo has huge news for you. Geely has bought 49% of Proton. I don't think they're as excited about this as we are. Should we tell them the other part? Okay, so you probably know of Geely because Geely are the folks that bought Volvo from Ford way back in the day and have presided over what we have now found to be an incredibly successful turnaround. Well, they have bought Proton. Now, Proton is a Malaysian car manufacturer, but they also have an ace in the hole in that they're the ones that own Lotus, lock, stock, and barrel. My beloved Lotus. So Kumo and I are going to attempt to break down the good and the bad news on this. I realize I am horrifically biased, so he insisted on being here on this episode with his favorite car, because he's not really a Lotus guy. Can't fit. So we're going to go through this and see if we can unpack what this means going on in the future for Lotus. Okay, so let's do this somewhat systematically because I will fully admit I am A, horrifically biased about Lotus, B, have spent far too much money on far too many Lotuses throughout the years, and C, that's probably one of the reasons I'm a huge Dave Ramsey fan, because I spent too much money on a specific car. With that, we need to break this into two columns. There's the good news and the bad news. Let's start with the good news. The good news is very simple. Geely has proven that they are well funded. So that means Proton and by design, Lotus will have more funding for more projects. Great news, right? Then the second piece of good news, and I would argue probably the bigger piece, is the demonstration that Geely has shown with the Volvo turnaround. Because I'll admit, I was one of those people that was scratching my head when Ford sold Volvo. I'm like, this is going to go the exact same way as Saab. It's going to be out of business. And to me, it was a little bit closer to home because I grew up partially on Volvos, and I really had a soft spot in my heart for Volvos. And if we're really being honest with each other, Chinese companies never really had a reputation for quality, never had a reputation for buying something and doing a lot with it prior to that point. But now fast forward into 2017, and here's a Chinese company that could have taken Volvo and drained everything out of it and basically started building copies of Volvos in China for their own domestic production or try to build them cheaper and sell them back to other parts of the world. But they elected to go a different path. They said, you know what, these people obviously know how to build, design, and engineer cars. They just got caught flat-footed under Ford that really didn't know what to do with Volvo and let it languish for too long. So they went and they researched and they realized they had some amazing people there. Now, Volvo is one of those companies, I would argue, like Chrysler, like Cadillac that we've learned over the years, where the same people have been there for 30, 40 years, like Dave Leone, and they were making the same cars back in the day that weren't too great. The problem was the leadership. They were telling them to do the wrong thing, and that's what they had to do because they were the boss. It's like the old golden rule, he who has the gold makes the rules. But then when General Motors and even Chrysler got some better management, you started seeing better vehicles come out of these car companies. So Geely looked at Volvo and realized, these guys know how to make cars. We shouldn't be telling them anything. So they went in and they said, you come up with a plan and you present us with a plan. If we feel that it is a good idea, we will back it. Now, I know this now because I've spent a lot of time getting to know the folks behind the scenes at Volvo and how many Volvos have we featured on the show. Just next week, I'm flying over to Spain to drive the XC60. So by the time you see this, I will probably be driving that vehicle. Anyway, the folks at Volvo, the engineers, the people running the company, took the time to come up with a very ambitious plan. I mean, you've seen some of the products they have now, but imagine proposing that. I think it's something like 17 new models in, I want to say, 5 years. That was the proposal of Geely. Geely could have said, are you nuts? We're never funding this. But instead, Geely said, you know what, that's a good idea. Let's do it. And it took a while. It took from them, 2010 to 2000 and almost 14, 15, when you and I saw the first fruits of that labor, which was the XC90. a stellar product. Like, there are so many of them out here in Los Angeles. I see them in New York as well. You probably see them in your region of the world. Anyway, I'm going too much on Volvo because I want you guys to understand that Geely took the long view, and it is so rare in today's day and age where every public company, like, look what Ford did recently. They just fired Mark Fields. The guy was there, what, 30 years? The guy knew what he was talking about. The guy had some vision for the company, and frankly, the stock market said we don't value Ford as much as Tesla, which is completely opposite and totally wrong. We can get into that in another episode. And what happened was Ford management didn't take the long view and they threw the guy out. Well, Geely did the exact opposite, and look at the returns they're getting now, what, 7 years after they bought the company. So how does this relate to Lotus? In the case of Lotus, they've always been a company where they've had people there for 30, 40 years since they started. The same people that were engineering cars back in the day of the Roger Moore, and, you know, God rest his soul, Roger Moore, Esprit, are the same people that were engineering the Evora today. Now, the reason why the Esprit was just a knockout and the Evora frankly isn't, is because they don't have as much funding. And so now here's a company that has more funding. But let's get to the third point, and this is what's, I think, even more important than the Volvo turnaround, is we're not looking at a company that has no track record. Geely now has a track record with Volvo in letting them do their own thing and letting them do what they do well. But in addition to that track record, now there's assets within the business unit. So if you think about it, Lotus really doesn't make their own engines, do they? Lotus doesn't really make their own transmissions. Well, Volvo just spent, what, the better part of 6 years coming up with an entire engine strategy that works for small cars all the way up to large SUVs. And something tells me that a 2-liter, 4-cylinder, turbocharged, supercharged, direct injected engine would work great in a Lotus, don't you think? And what about the electrification? All of the work and the research that Volvo has been doing, don't you think they could find a home at Lotus as well? And then think about it in reverse. All the engineering assets, the driving dynamics that are coming out of a company like Lotus, think about what that could do for a company like Volvo. So it's not just a one-way street, it's a two-way street, because over the years, and you guys can laugh at me because, yeah, I'm a Lotus freak, but over the years, Lotus has always been that engineering company that other car companies go to tune their vehicles. And the most recent example I'll give you, which is highly successful, the Hyundai Genesis, when it was a Hyundai Genesis, when it changed to this current generation, it was kind of an also-ran. It was a great bargain of a car. It was like, oh, it's a great car for the price. But then they hired Matthew Becker of Lotus, now of Aston Martin, to tune the engine of just the US build of that car. And now I would argue it's one of the best mid-size sports sedans on the market today, bar none. And that's because of Lotus engineering. So this is all the good news. So funding, the track record that Geely has, as well as the assets within the business. I'm going to add something else a little bit more personal. Some of the engineering, the brain trust at Volvo, guys like Stefan, you guys have not seen him on camera yet. He is going to come on camera. He is the man that runs the engineering and the product for the 90 cluster of cars. So the S90, the V90, the XC90, all of that, that's his product. So imagine the man that ran that from a company that was underfunded to a company that all of a sudden got funding. Imagine the brain trust that he could transfer to Lotus in developing the right car with the right budget. So this is all the good news. Now let's talk about the bad news. The bad news is it's still 51% owned by Proton. I can't really tell you who, I can't tell you why I know this, but let's just say that the Malaysians have stood in the way of Lotus's growth. They really haven't funded it well. I feel they've been very short-sighted, and as a result, there's been a brain drain. Like, for example, some people have left Lotus and have gone to places like McLaren and Aston Martin. As a matter of fact, a number of the disavowed of Lotus are now at those two companies making great cars like this. So that leads us to two really important, I don't want to say bad news, but things I'm concerned about. My biggest concern is, has the brain drain of Lotus being, for lack of a better term, for being neglected over many years, has that brain drain, will that be a permanent blow to Lotus? I don't have an answer to that right now because I don't know who they've replaced vehicle dynamics with when Matthew left or some of the other folks that have left. And then last but certainly not least, and this is a little bit more personal. And this is, put aside the joking I do about Lotus and Porsche and all that kind of stuff, that 911 Targa is ridiculous. I mean, it's ridiculous. Like, to the point where I would say no to a Lotus. I would buy the 911 Targa, and we talked about in the Dave Ramsey episode, when I am going to buy a 911 Targa for a daily driver. And that's the problem, because here's a guy that is, I don't even want to admit how many Lotuses I've had, because it's embarrassing. But I'm like dyed-in-the-wool kind of Lotus, and frankly, the company hasn't been very receptive to me and my show as of late. But even though they haven't, I still love the cars, and I love the people there and the people that design, engineer, and build those cars. But here's a guy that is like, it's a religion for me, a Lotus, and now I'm considering a car I never would have considered because it's that good. So the question in my mind is, has the combination of the brain drain, but more importantly, the fact that there really hasn't been product out there, has it made the faithful like me go somewhere else? Is that a problem going into the future of Lotus, even underneath Geely ownership? That said, I hope I'm wrong. And what I'm really looking for here is not just what Geely did with Volvo Act 2, rather I'm looking for Geely and Volvo to partner, to go to Hethel, sit down and say, you know what, we know you've been beating around a bit too much, and rather than what's happened in the past, here's a clean sheet of paper, go and sort yourself out. And oh, by the way, here are some assets that we've built over the past 7 years that might help things out. Now that's my personal hope, and really it's going to come down to two numbers. Geely owns 49% of Proton, and Proton owns 51% of Proton. So if you look at voter control, Proton is still in the driver's seat, and that's the only thing that just, it doesn't sit well with my heart. So with that, I'm going to turn this around to you guys, and I'm going to ask you your thoughts on this. Do you feel this is a very good development for Lotus, or do you feel this is not a good development for Lotus and Proton will stand in the way? And don't just tell me yes or no, but I'm looking for a rather in-depth reason as to why or why not. And for added measure, do you own a Lotus, or have you ever owned a Lotus? And you know what? Do you own a current Volvo, meaning a Geely era Volvo? Let me know in the comments below, or via our social media at MotoManTV all in word, MotoManTV all in word, Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. And with that, I want to leave you with two things. Number one, please unsubscribe to us, and then resubscribe, and then click notifications. This is how much YouTube has screwed up the entire platform for YouTubers big and small. And number two, a fun fact, and I really should have put this under the good news column of this whole discussion. So Stefan, the man I mentioned, who is the program manager for all of the 90 cluster of cars for Volvo, he not only has a lot of experience on how to build a great vehicle from scratch with Geely that he could share with Lotus, he also has intimate knowledge of sports cars. You see, when the weather is nice for like 3 days in Sweden, at home in his garage that he doesn't tell many people about, he has a 911. Until I see you next time, bis später.